for Knowing the Audience. Part 1 of Road to Results, 9 Steps for Identifying, Researching, and Building Audiences. My name is Adam Lafaci, your host joining from Learning Times. And it's my pleasure to turn the floor over to your moderator for today, Greg Stevens.
Thank you very much, Adam, and thank you for hosting us from Learning Times. Welcome, everyone, to today's program, the first of a 3-part series generously sponsored by the Wallace Foundation. We're very happy to be working with the Wallace Foundation, not only on this series, but also for a session at our upcoming annual meeting in Atlanta. And of course, today's program, as most of you know, is directly connected to the recent Wallace report, The Road to Results, Effective Practices for Building Arts Audiences. So that's what today's program and the subsequent 2 programs is all about. I'm very happy to be joined by my colleagues in several of AAM's professional networks, including PRAM, EdCom, CARE, and Leadership and Management. Each of these committees has hosted several local webinar watch and talk events around the country. And we also have several of them joining us on the program today as our special guests. So thank you to our colleagues from the professional networks. And I do also want to take a moment to give a virtual shout out and a wave to our colleagues who are hosting webinar watch and talk events around the country. And you can see a listing of them here in front of you. So we really appreciate the generosity of each of you opening up your doors at your institution to welcome your local colleagues for some exchange of information, ideas, and inspiration. I am very happy to welcome today's presenters, each of whom you'll be hearing from a little bit later in the program. Our lead presenter is Bob Harlow, who is the author of the Road to Results report that we are talking about today. And Bob will be joined by Beth Tuttle, who is the co-author of Magnetic, the Art and Science of Engagement, an AAM publication. And you'll learn a little bit more about the connections between Magnetic and the Road to Results a bit later in our program. I'm also very happy to have Magda Martinez on board from the Fleischer Art Memorial. And last but not least, Christopher Taylor from the Clay Studio. And Magda and Chris just happened to come from Philadelphia. And I mentioned special guests a bit ago, and I'd like to welcome them formally and let you put their names and faces together. We have Sarah Lee joining us from Slover Linnet Audience Research, and she is representing CARE, our Committee on Audience Research and Evaluation. And my friend and colleague, Betty Brewer, who is the President and CEO of Minitrista, representing our Leadership and Management Professional Network. Tim Hallman, our colleague, representing PRAM. He comes from the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. And Sarah Jesse, my colleague in education at LACMA, who is also chair of our Educators Committee. So thank you all for being here and sharing your expertise throughout the program. Today's program is, as I mentioned, first of a 3-part series, and we'll do a quick overview of the Road to Results study and report, and you should all have gotten a link to that report. We're going to talk about the connections between Road to Results and Magnetic. We'll provide you a couple of case studies from the Fleischer Art Memorial and the Clay Studio. And then we're all going to engage in some colleague conversation with each other and with you in response to any questions or comments that you may have as we go through the program. And our overarching goals for this series are to help you find ways to use research and data to support whatever audience building initiatives you may have at your institution. We also hope that you'll come away with some ideas about how you can engage both your internal and external stakeholders in this important process of audience building, and recognize the challenges that you might face in a changing museum environment and what kinds of things might impact you and your audience building strategies. Before we get formally started with the program, we wanted to put these guiding questions in front of you, and you are free to respond to these questions in the chat box if you'd like. But they're really just thought questions to get you thinking about this series and today's program in particular. And then another question that we wanted to get you to think about and respond to is, why engage in audience building at your institution anyway? What's the purpose? What's the rationale behind it? If you are engaging in it currently, why are you doing so? If you're thinking about it, why are you thinking about doing it? What are the situations or the circumstances? So as we go along, think about that and perhaps type some comments or thoughts into the chat box. And now it is my great pleasure to turn the stage and the microphone over to our colleague, Bob Harlow. He's going to give us a quick overview of today's, of the Road to Results report. Bob.
Great. Thank you very much, Greg. And I'm very pleased to be here and delighted that you're all sharing part of your afternoon with us. I wanted to say a little bit about what the work is about and then talk about some of the key practices that we identified related to knowing audiences. Now, I'm a market researcher who does a lot of both market research as well as program evaluation. And I was asked by the Wallace Foundation to lead a team of researchers conducting in-depth reviews of the organizations they've been working with to identify what practices contribute to sustained audience gain. All right? And they asked my team to look at 54 organizations that have received funding for 3 to 4 year periods between 2007 and 2012. Now, of those 54 organizations, some had great success, others didn't. And our key question was, what made the difference? And we're actually able to look at that question with quite a bit of rigor, because throughout the initiative, funding included budgets for research and evaluation. Wallace included that element to address the need for more evidence-based guidance of what works in building audiences. Wallace really hopes to help institutions act less on hunches and more on principles that have been shown to work. So within 54 organizations that Wallace funded over a 6 or 7 year period, we looked in particular at those successes where audience growth was sustained even after the funding had stopped. And we focused on 10 organizations of 54, chosen largely because they had cohesive strategies and strong results. Now, these 10 organizations were chosen for individual case study. And if you look at it, you can see it's a real mixed bag, right? It includes performing individual arts organizations of different shapes and sizes. And when we first started, our full intention when we set them out, when we set out, was to treat these as individual case studies, not have them speak to each other. But when we looked across diverse organizations, we actually found common themes. And in fact, we identified 9 practices that were associated with successful audience building across a diverse range of organizations. Now, I don't want to say that these are the only 9 practices. I mean, I'm sure there are more, right? But these are practices that have been proven. Now, how could it be? What could opera and ballet companies with $20 million budgets in Seattle have in common with smaller visual arts organizations in Philadelphia or a museum focused on Jewish art and ideas in San Francisco? Well, all the organizations that you're looking at had the same challenge, and that was engaging and building following among people who may be unfamiliar with the kind of art that they present. Audiences who may not see them as relevant, but who the organizations deemed were important and wanted to go after. Now, that's a tall order, and building that kind of a following takes time and sustained effort, because organizations need to learn how to work with new audiences. Also, you know, it's not going to happen after just one visit, right? It takes time for new audiences to build the kinds of meaningful connections and relationships with arts organizations to keep them coming back. I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone on this phone call that this is hard work over a long trajectory. It's not something that can be taken casually or lightly. It requires a prolonged commitment from the organization to get to know and serve audiences. Basically, we're asking audiences to change their behavior, and we may need to make some changes ourselves in how we do things for that relationship to develop. Now, these are the 9 practices that we found that help make that happen. And today we're going to focus just on the first 4, the things that prompt the initiative and help the organizations get to know audiences. What's that about, okay? We need to get to know the audience, understand who they are, and what they may need to get the most out of their visit. Successful organizations among the Wallace grantees focused on a particular audience and learning how to work well with that audience. One-size-fits-all strategies were not as meaningful to visitors. They weren't as successful in building a kind of connection to get people excited enough to return. These were really tailor-made strategies. There's also, we talk about learning about the audiences, but there's also the flip side. How do we help new audiences get to know us? It was a useful question for many organizations to ask. Many organizations looked in the mirror and said, are we easy to get to know? If a newcomer visited our institution or even our website, would they find accessible ways in? If not, what do we need to do to help people get to know us? Those are the things, and so focus today on learning about audiences. Now, before I jump in, and we'll get to the other steps, I should say, practice 5 through 9 in other webinars. Before I jump in, let me say that in trying to understand best practices in audience building, there's a temptation to focus just on tactics and activities. Those are like the really sexy things like the after-hour social events or the social media strategies. But successful audience building, at least for those organizations that were successful working with Wallace, was much more than that. Success came when arts organizations became focused on building relationships over a long period and committing themselves to making that happen. Learning about audiences was a key first step. The end game, of course, isn't just one visit, but ongoing relationships. Okay, how did it all start? Successful initiatives actually didn't begin with plans and objectives or even with a goal in mind. Instead, successful initiatives were prompted when organizations recognized change as mission critical. It's not something that they could take casually or lightly. This is hard work. Like I said, it requires a long-term commitment. And something needs to happen in order for it to become a top priority for the organization. If it's not a top priority, it's not going to work out. And for successful organizations and those that Wallace had worked with, something told them they needed to do something different, something drastic. Leaders and staff saw changes in their environment, like a drop-off in attendance or audience stagnation. Some were looking at national data and participation patterns and believed that they needed to do things differently in order to stay relevant. Success stories were prompted by very real challenges that instilled a sense of urgency. And that sense of urgency was important because it kept the organization's attention and focus over a long period. And that's really what's necessary. Just some examples from some organizations that we'll hear from today. Fletcher Art Memorial offers free and low-cost classes to thousands in Philadelphia. And it happens to be located in one of the most diverse areas of Philadelphia, traditionally a landing place for newly arrived peoples from other countries. And perhaps not surprisingly, it was founded around the turn of the 20th century with a mission to make art accessible to people of diverse backgrounds. It was in an immigrant community, and it really had a mission to make art available to a wide range of people. The organization was successful for many, many years, serving waves of immigrants, but the numbers started to change around them. The audience building initiative was prompted when staff began to realize that the organization was not keeping up with those shifts. Newly arrived people from Mexico and Southeast Asia weren't coming in large numbers, and that really got under the skin of staff at Fleischer. It kept them up at night. That kind of impetus is really helps audience building because it's that stuff that keeps it on the front burner. Similarly, you also hear from the Clay Studio today, also in Philadelphia. They have classes in ceramics as well as a gallery in the shop, and they recognized that they weren't seeing new faces. The audience was getting older, and the staff realized they needed to identify who would be the next generation of the porters. And that gave rise to a successful initiative that brought in young professionals by the hundred. Both of these groups, Fleischer and Clay, had things keeping them up at night, and they set out to build their audiences. One thing that really helped their success is that when they target audiences, they found audiences that were a good fit for the organization. And I want to talk about what that good fit looks like. That was second practice. In targeting a particular audience, they identified an audience that they knew from research or past experience that they could satisfy. Maybe they've seen it in work at other institutions, or maybe something in their own market research pointed to an audience in waiting. At Clay Studio, for example, they've seen research about how young adults warm up to more active kinds of participation, and they created opportunities for them to have that. A second piece of that fit, though, the fit has two sides. The one that actually ends up often not getting paid a lot of attention to, but really drives that long-term commitment, is that leaders see the audience as important. You know, like I mentioned, Fleischer, making art accessible to a broad range of people is important to the mission. And in fact, that's what had attracted leaders and the board to the organization. So when they set out to target people from the ethnically diverse surrounding communities, it was something leaders could really rally behind. You know, one of the board members told me, there was no question. This is who we are. This is what we do. So, and it was wonderful to see that, but I have to say that does not always happen. Sometimes audiences are pursued where some leaders, department heads, or curators may question if it's the right audience. They even think of going after a new audience as a distraction, or potentially dumbing down what they do. It sounds harsh, I know, but it's unfortunately it's what I saw. It's what my team saw. You know, if leaders of an organization don't agree that the audience makes sense to pursue, the initiative won't get that long-term attention it needs to develop, and won't be able to build momentum. Now, once the audience was identified, or that the organizations were going to go after, they considered carefully what kinds of barriers were facing that audience. And it turned out that the barriers that needed to be addressed depended on the audience's prior inclination to attend arts institutions or otherwise participated in the arts. Now, there were some organizations who targeted people who were already inclined to take part in the arts. They were already culturally active, but they may not be taking part in that specific organization. Staff found that to get them in, they needed to remove practical barriers. Perhaps the price was too high, or the commitment level was too large. The Play Studio, for example, found that young professionals were culturally active, but their main course offering that they had for newcomers were 10-week, $300 classes. Now, it's actually a bargain given the level of instruction that Play Studio offers, but it's just too much for newcomers. Someone who isn't sure that they want to take part. The Clay Studio had unintentionally erected barriers to participating, and by creating shorter formats at lower price points, they found they could really bring in young adults by the hundreds. Other organizations were targeting audiences who were disinclined. They expressed no interest in the organization. For those audiences, perceptions were the barriers that needed to be addressed. Often we found perceptions that the art, they thought the art had nothing to offer. Maybe they thought the museum visit it would have nothing for their children, or they wouldn't know how to share it with their children. In some cases, we found perceptions of elitism in organizations. Those perceptions may not actually have been reflective of what was going on in those organizations, but the target audiences believed them to be true, and so for them, they were. Now, if perceptions of an art form or an organization were the things that were getting in the way for this disinclined audience, that's what needs to be targeted first. So when organizations are going after a disinclined audience, they had to target those perceptions. And that's really hard work. In fact, that's the hardest work of all, is changing perception. But it needs to be done. Finally, there were some organizations who were looking to increase engagement with current audiences. They found that could be done by providing a different kind of experience. Now, this sort of scheme, some of you may be familiar with it, this scheme that matches audience inclination to barriers. It's sometimes called the new framework, or the RAND model for building audience participation. Now, not all organizations follow this scheme, but by and large, success came when they followed it, and if they didn't succeed. The final practice I want to give you a quick overview of today is we call taking out the guesswork. And it's such a real game changer. Now, we call it taking out the guesswork, but it's really learning about your audience with research. Now, in most cases, organizations were targeting audiences that they knew little about. They really were flying blind, and they were tasked with developing programs that would bring in people that they hadn't had success with in the past. You can just imagine, that's a huge challenge. They wanted to bring in these basically unknown entities. They hadn't had success working with them in the past. They didn't really know much about them, but they didn't let their lack of experience with that target audience get in the way, nor did they design programs by the seat of their pants. Instead, they used audience research to pinpoint exactly what barriers were standing in the way, and also identify what might pique the interest of the target audience. And it wasn't often what they thought. There were some organizations, for example, that were targeting young audiences, and you typically heard from them, they thought that the newer way in with young people was contemporary work. But they actually found the opposite was true once they did the research, and once they looked at their box office and other ticketing data. For their first experiences, young newcomers actually want to see more traditional work. Contemporary work just frankly strikes them as weird and bizarre, and it even scares them more than traditional work. Now, organizations can use market research to identify those inclinations and tastes and preferences, and also can use market research to develop more effective programs and tactics. Now, a real poster child for using market research to transform an organization was the Clay Studio, who you'll hear from today. I'm going to steal a little bit of their thunder just by telling you some of the changes they made and how they used research intelligently to make huge changes in their organization. Now, they use research, they use observation, they use their own market research, they also use nationally available studies, and just keep their eyes and ears open. And they found, and when they did that, they came up with insights that helped them come to adjustments in their programming and their marketing that led to success. For example, when they had heard that 10-week classes were too large of a commitment for newcomers, they made classes with shorter commitments, like 5 weeks or 1 day, or even a few hours with lower price points. And when they did that, over a period of 4 years, their enrollment tripled and their school revenue doubled. I mean, those are huge results. They also knew from national studies that young adults were looking for interactive, memorable experiences, and they leveraged that insight and created social workshops with working potters that gave hands-on instruction to working with clay. When they did market research, they found that the brochures were overwhelming for people who hadn't been to the Clay Studio before. They just had too much stuff in them, too much detail on all the studio's activities. Young people and young newcomers couldn't find their way in. So they developed targeted communications for different audience segments around exhibits, events, or classes and workshops. They also found when they did focus groups that they had all these brochures that had beautiful images of ceramic objects on them, really wonderful, lovely images. But those didn't move people that weren't familiar with the institution. Instead, they were really fascinated by images that showed people working with clay, what they could actually do with the Clay Studio. That was a whole set of the institution that they were just really fascinated by. And the Clay Studio leveraged that insight by incorporating action words and images into its promotional materials. This next quote is from, this next quote here is just really sums up how they changed their orientation. It's from the former Clay Studio president and CEO, A. Sarner Williams, talking about a tagline that appeared on their brochures and the reaction they got in focus groups. We had this tagline, "Shaping the Future of Ceramics." That was great, but that was for us, not so much for this audience. That was a real eye-opener. People would say to us in these focus groups, "Why would I look at this? Why would that make me want to come? I've got to look at something and right away see there's something there for me." Clay Studio ran with that insight. This slide actually shows some of the before and after marketing material. You can see on the left side of each of these two boxes, this is what their marketing materials look like before they did their focus groups. They had images of the objects, which are wonderful to see. But once they heard how fascinated young people were with the idea of creating clay and working with clay, they realized they have a huge studio, workshop, they could really leverage that and started to put those images in their communication. And they got really smart. They then started to focus their website, not so much on what the Clay Studio had, but what you could do with the Clay Studio. So these are just some pages, and they're probably very small on your screen, but saying you can learn, you can shop. There's a whole organizational framework there that the website became structured around. That's all I want to say right now. I should say that all of these reports are available on the Wallace Foundation website for free. Some of these particular case studies by Clay and Fleischer will be available later in the year. In addition, there's a market research guidebook called Taking Out the Guesswork on how to use research that will also be available for free download and also hard copy if you want to get it from Wallace later in the year. Now I'd like to turn it back to Greg.
Thanks very much, Bob. I appreciate you providing that thoughtful overview on the Road to Results report and highlighting a little bit of the work at Clay Studio and Fleischer Art Memorial. And we'll be hearing from Magda and Chris in just a moment. But I want to pause now and address any questions or comments that might be coming in from the audience, but also turn to our special guests who are in the audience with us to see if you have any comments or questions at this time. And Adam, I know in the spirit of knowing your audience, we're going to reach out to our audience to find out how many people are convened with them in their locations. So, special guests, anything that you want to add to what Bob has just provided an overview on?
This is Sarah Lee from Silverlina Audience Research in Boston. And I would just pick up on and sort of elaborate on some of what Bob said about the new framework. We've done some work with a number of museums and other performing arts organizations as well that suggest that even among audiences who are inclined to attend a performance or visit a museum or generally participate with a certain kind of art form, that even if they are already inclined, sometimes there are perceptual barriers about the experience that can still prevent them or make attendance a little less compelling to them. And I'm thinking in particular of some work that we did with a contemporary art museum a few years ago, where we were looking at an audience that we sort of defined as the almost here audience. So people who thought of themselves as very predisposed towards visiting a contemporary art museum and participated in a lot of culture generally, but for them there were still a lot of perceptual barriers about what they expected the atmosphere of a contemporary art museum to feel like to them, a sort of sense that they weren't sure what the experience would be like, and a sense that they weren't sure that that experience would be like, would be something that sort of felt relevant to them. So even for that highly inclined audience, it can still be really important to look at perceptual barriers in addition to those practical barriers that may inhibit attendance for them.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. I mean, the RAND framework was written, and it talks about perceptions of the arts in general, but we actually also found that you really had to look at the organization. It's really organization and art form specific.
Great, thanks, Sarah and Bob. And actually, a question has come in that relates to what you're talking about. And how does all of this relate to history organizations? Do you see any differences in the audiences or their motivations for different types of museums or different types of cultural organizations?
Yeah, I mean, I can take that. I mean, I wouldn't think, I mean, I would actually think it would be very, very similar. I mean, we're really talking about people and how they are spending their leisure time. So, if you're going after an inclined audience, I mean, that's what we're talking about, the framework, or is it all of the principles? If we're talking about the new framework, it'd really be the same thing, looking at audience inclination, figuring out what the barriers are according to that. I don't know if we're talking about particular insights or beyond that or not.
Perhaps it's, the question specifically was, do you have any insight as to the transferability of these principles to history organizations? So the steps that you've outlined in this part of the program, would they be the same kinds of steps or initiatives that a history organization might take, whether it's a history
Got it. You know, it's interesting. I mean, I've actually talked about this work with people that have worked in zoos and aquariums, which I know are different, but also science museums, so many different audiences. And I can just say that they, at least as far as their own gut, they say this really rings true with what we've been seeing. So I would say these are actually transferable. I mean, a lot of these things, too, that are in the road to results, it's really surprising. I mean, we wanted to identify what were effective principles. We thought it was going to be tactics and programs, but so much of this stuff is organizational. What gets this initiative to be at the focus of the organization? How do we get everybody on board? So in these organizational things, and you'll find the road to results, as far as a lot of the management literature, it's very much not art specific, even though it applies very much to art organizations.
Yeah, this is Sarah Lee again, and I'll jump in and say that resonates from our work too. We work with history museums and science-based museums as well as zoos and aquariums, and I think that the general idea of sort of marrying your mission-based goals, sort of where you want to go as an organization, and thinking about what is relevant and compelling to the audiences that you want to reach. I think that those general principles are equally important in other disciplines as they are in the arts, and that general approach feels like the right approach to take. I think that some of the specifics about sort of what that looks like in terms of the tactics that you would use to reach audiences or to make your experience compelling to them might be different in different kinds of museums, but I think this general, as a general roadmap for how to understand your audiences and think about who you want to engage more deeply or more broadly, I think that this makes sense.
And Bob, what are your thoughts about a new museum that's getting started? How might they embark on a research agenda to know who might be coming, or who should be coming, or who they want to have coming to their institutions?
Yeah, I mean, that's where you really have to look at what, it sort of depends on what the museum has to offer. But certainly we found that organizations, when they found a lot, they identified new audiences by looking at thinking back to their own experiences at other institutions, like this kind of an audience could really work here. Research that was available in the field. They really did sort of, there was sort of a little bit of vision. So it's not just doing research and identifying this is the audience, right? I mean, there was a lot of vision with it as well. They sort of envisioned, could this audience work here? I'm thinking of, for example, of the Contemporary Jewish Museum, which was an organization that hadn't, they expanded into a space that was 20 times the size of its former facility. And they then said, how are we going to fill it? And the executive director at the time, she had been at the Whitney Museum, and she had called, what families made that place dynamic? Can we do that? And she started to ask those kinds of questions. So there's a little bit of a triangulation between looking at research, past experience, and also visionaries. So it's not, I don't know if I can think of one organization that said, let's just do some research and that got there. It was a bit of triangulation on all of those things. Yeah, and of course, keeping in mind what the vision of the organization was.
I apologize. This is Beth Tuttle weighing in. Having done this when we initially conceptualized the museum, the Interactive Museum of News in Washington, many years ago, there really wasn't anything similar to that to really look to. So the way we did our audience identification was that we first looked at the market, and of course we were in a tourism market in Washington, D.C. So we looked at who was coming. We then began to do some direct sampling of different elements of that market to begin to understand what was important to them. The news is a fairly broad-based category and topic, so it could be people who are interested in sports, it could be people interested in history, and we began to do exactly what Bob says, which is the triangulation. At the end of the day, probably the most important insight that we gained, and it's very similar to the one you just mentioned from the Contemporary Jewish Museum, was that we were almost, probably 2/3 of the way through all the planning and design. And the research that we were doing came back and said, 50% of the visitors to Washington have children under the age of 18 in their group. If you do not build an experience that is good for the family, you will not build an experience that's good for anyone in the family. And that really caused some very significant thinking and changes in the makeup of the museum. I can remember clearly meeting where the president at the time looked at me and said, "Are you telling us we need to build a children's museum?" And the answer was no, you need to build a museum that accommodates the needs of families with children. And that was a huge difference, and it made all the difference in the world for the museum.
Great, thanks very much, Beth. And I think this is a perfect segue to your portion of today's program, and that is the magnetic connection. So I'm going to turn the stage and the microphone over to you now officially.
Thank you. So, hi everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you and to have the opportunity to draw some links from the magnetic study to this really important Road to Resolve report. For those of you who are not familiar, magnetic is the result of a 3-year study that Anne Bergeron and I conducted, looking at the practices of museums that had outperformed their peers in terms of their ability to attract and retain resources in the first decade of the 21st century. And we began with a quantitative look at organizations, at a number of quantitative performance metrics that were specifically related to growth and resources, although in the end we did not equate growth with necessarily better. So I just want to say that. But after we looked at that, we then too went down deep and did identified a handful of museums that had really changed their organizations dramatically, and we went in to study what had happened in those institutions. And what we learned is that each of these museums, very much like the case study groups that are with us on the webinar today, they had successfully transformed their organizations by adopting concerted strategies focused around deepening engagement with their internal and their external communities. So while Magnetic very much largely focused on understanding the new rules for engagement and the organizational impacts of adopting this as a central strategy for change, I think what the Road to Results does is it takes us a step further and provides such a useful primer for the how-to side of things. In Magnetic, we wrote about the 4 types of capital that these highly successful organizations develop and retain. We wrote about core capital, and that's really the human and intellectual resources as well as the tangible assets of collections and facilities that are required to deliver meaningful programs and experiences. Brand capital is the thing that really encompasses the goodwill, the trust, and that reputational equity that make up some of the most critical intangible aspects of highly magnetic and successful organizations. The third of these was financial capital, which is, of course, self-explanatory and quite honestly is the result of building the other forms of capital. And finally, we looked at this concept of social capital, which is a term very closely associated with Robert Putnam's work on communities. This is clearly the place where the magnetic study intersects with the Road to Results, because while building new audiences might serve any number of different kinds of organizational purposes, it always results in increased social capital. So whether the efforts are designed to bond existing audiences more tightly to your institution or to build bridges to new audiences or to build bridges between different audiences, when museums and other cultural organizations that really serve as anchors in their communities engage in these practices, they are really weaving this stronger fabric for their communities. As a result of the magnetic study, a broader definition of engagement began to emerge, and I thought it might provide a useful context for our thinking about building audiences. You can see that definition here on the screen, but we'll note that there's an emphasis on 3 key aspects of it. The first of these is it's about building trust. The second is that it focuses on creating meaning and meaningful experiences. And the third is facilitating relationships between the organization and its stakeholders and among its stakeholders. In just a minute, you're going to hear from Magda and Chris, but both of those organizations' stories show that they also embrace this sort of nuanced understanding of what audience building and engagement are all about. Because this form of engagement goes much beyond, it's not just a marketing strategy by any means. It's something that goes to the heart of the organization, and it really changes the organization very fundamentally when they commit to this kind of work. So the magnetic museum leaders that we studied, they found success by pursuing engagement that comes at this intersection that Sarah Lee was just mentioning. It's the intersection of mission and meaning and market. So it's really driving out of the core focus of the organization. It is intended to create truly meaningful kinds of experiences, right? To meet real needs of the community as opposed to meet real needs of the organization. And it's informed by a very deep market understanding, which is what is going on around us, what are these people interested in, what do we know about them, who are they, those kinds of questions. It brings me to the other parallel that we saw between the magnetic study and the road to results. All organizations we studied began with a period of discovery, deep self-reflection, and learning. And I think that's really what's embodied in those first 4 steps that Bob talked about. Sometimes that impetus for change or a new focus on engagement was really internally driven. So there might have been a transition in board or professional leadership, which brought the introduction of a new organizational vision. But oftentimes it was externally driven by changes in finance or social forces that had, either caused some kind of negative effect on the organization, or someone perceived that need for that there was a possibility to open a new door of opportunity. Either way, once that need for change was recognized, and above all, once that need for change was expressed and owned in a sort of shared sense of urgency, an imperative to make the change, all of those magnetic institutions began to use qualitative or quantitative data to develop market insights that guided their actions. So this move from data to insights is a really important link. The process has to work from the inside out, but also from the outside in. And I think this kind of transformation work requires deep self-examination. It requires kind of curiosity and a willingness to listen and learn and act upon what we hear. It requires gaining a real understanding of the stakeholders and their needs, as well as their aspirations. And ultimately, it does rely on using all that information, that data, to inform the decisions that you make. And of course, that's very near and dear to my heart as the CEO of the Cultural Data Project. We'll talk more about the role of data and where and how to get it, but I think now it's probably best if I just hand it off to Magda to tell us her story for the Fleischer Art Memorial.
Well, Beth, before we go to Magda, I just want to, I know that some of our special guests had some thoughts as you were talking about the information you gleaned from the magnetic study. Betty, I think you had some insights about the process at your institution, Minnetrista. Betty, I think you might be on mute still.
Is that better?
Yes.
I'm sorry. We began this process about 5 years ago. It feels like we've been in it for much longer than that. But listening to Bob and Beth talk about this and the values and the importance of leadership engagement, and I want to talk about how we began this process at our leadership table as a whole. So it was the entire leadership team of the institution that talked this through. We talked about the issues we've been having with our audiences, identifying them, understanding them, knowing how to serve them. And it was also the beginning of a new strategic planning process for us. This took the forefront of everything all the major things we did in the next several years. All the things that Beth was talking about, utilizing the data once you get it. We worked with a research firm and identified our audiences in a meaningful way to us. And it just led to a cascade effect of new processes and new ways of working and thinking at Minnetrista. We had a goal of becoming audience-centric, and that's what we've been focusing on. And I think it's also really important to note, Greg, that this is a process that never really ends, because you're constantly evaluating and constantly looking at your services and are you meeting your needs and is your audience growing?
Right, and I appreciate that. And Sarah, Jesse, I know that you had some thoughts from the education point of view.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, I did just want to pipe in because I really liked what Beth just said about this not just being a marketing strategy or a marketing effort, because I really feel like audience development is definitely within the purview of museum education, for example, and a critical part of our responsibility. I think that this has always been the case in museums, but particularly today, I think the extent to which we dedicate resources to this sophistication kind of rigor that we have behind work is new, and I think reports like this really help us codify some of these ideas that we've been talking about in the field. I mean, these concepts of building a long-term relationship, having institutional buy-in, removing real and perceived barriers, these are all things that educators have talked about for a long time, but what's new today is that we have this sort of codification, the articulation of best practices in a common language, and I think that's elevating the work that we do, one, and two, I think it's benefiting our audiences. So I think reports like this are really important, and I'm glad, Beth, that you mentioned that this isn't within the purview of the marketers.
I think when it happens just in the purview of the marketers, the audience knows. I think when it's not authentically motivated from the entire organization, its mission and its focus, people know, and then it doesn't feel real.
And so now I'm going to put Tim Hallman on the spot as our representative from PR and marketing. Guy. So,
me too,
what do you have to say?
I came out of the marketing side too.
And I couldn't agree more with Sarah and Betty. We did some really strong segmentation studies 7 years ago, and it's still with us today. And it is not driven for primarily marketing purposes. It is getting back to that's thought about mission, meaning, and market. It's how we use the data, and the marketing team helps cultivate it and look at it. But it's to help determine the interpretive strategy for our programming, and it does inform the marketing messages. But that's, again, trying to make sure that it is pure and on and meaningful. And then we measure it all the time just to make sure that it is working. So I couldn't agree with my colleagues more. It's an institutional, it has to be an institutional value from top to bottom and sideways. It's just, that's how it works best.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim, and thank you all for weighing in. And now we will officially turn our attention to Magda, who's going to share with us a little bit more about Fleischer Art Memorial. Magda, thanks for being with us today.
No problem. Thank you all, and I hope everyone's really excited by what we've heard so far, because I am. So I am Director of Programs here at the Fleischer Art Memorial, and we are situated in Philadelphia, and we are actually founded by an industrial, Samuel Fleischer. We serve about 14,000 people annually through our adult programs, exhibitions, work with young people, and have an operational budget of about $2.2 million. And this map just offers those who might not be from Philadelphia an idea of where we are situated in the city. And as Bob mentioned before, traditionally this area of the city has been where many newly arrived people have first settled. At the turn of the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, it was a very big port city, and people were coming through those ports. And we are very close to those ports. So there we are. So what made us pursue this work? And I want to say a few things before I get to that, which is that we entered this work, and I think this can sometimes be really important and build on what other people are saying. We started this work in a moment of transition, not in a moment of crisis. And I think that can actually change the way you look at the work and also how long you are willing to wait for results. So for us, this wasn't necessarily a financial imperative. It was very strongly built into our mission. And it was based in programs. So at Fleischer, we don't have a marketing department, but we also don't have an outreach program or a community engagement program. This really is embedded, the work is embedded throughout the institution. So these are the three major areas that made us pursue the work. And number one really was the most important, sustaining a focus on mission. We had also begun to see that we were doing work off-site and actually seeing the changes in the population around us in real time, especially with the work we do in public schools. But we weren't seeing that external change was actually matching our internal participant profile. And that concerned us. And we were also very clear that we were preparing for tomorrow's participants. And I'll talk a little more about that later, which is, when you are embarking on this work, you will become multilingual. Different people want to hear different things about what's important about the work. And one of the things we felt really strongly about was this was the future population that would support Fleischer. And so not to invest in them now would be short-sighted. So this is Sam, and he had very specific ideas about art and the role it played in people's lives. He thought art could be a great social equalizer. So if people could come to a place where they made art and they had access to free art, then their first initial contacts with each other would be as a community of makers. And then the conversations about what they did outside those walls would emerge, but they would happen in a different context. And that is still really important to us. And here is Fleischer's mission. We aspire, and I think that's important because it keeps us asking questions of ourselves. Are we doing the work? And also that this mission allows Fleischer to think about who's participating, the design of our policy, the development of our programs, and actually has been the core of what's carried us through this arc of time with our engagement work. And it allowed the whole organization to rally around the work. So the mission really is core, and how people interpret that mission is equally as important. As I mentioned, there were changes happening off-site in our community immediately surrounding us, changing demographics. And while we were experiencing that in real time with our external programming, we work in schools and after-school centers and with elders. While we were seeing that shift off-site in real time, we weren't seeing it internally. And that caused us to question what was going on, right? Why were those people happy to have us where they were? They weren't necessarily visiting our institution. What was happening there? And also, in just a very practical way, there are issues of sustainability, right? So could we sustain two, so to speak, separate identities over time? And the other thing we realized was that there were other organizations, such as religious organizations, social service organizations, that actually were better at responding to these changes in real time. So this is just an example of a church nearby that was built in the 1900s by a predominantly Italian community at that time. We sit in a section of the city that has something called the Italian Market, but the church itself was already responding to the changes in demographics by offering services in multiple languages, and that list is longer now. We also used census information and looked at the rate of growth in different communities over time and what the U.S. Census was predicting at the time, to also help us think about this in a real way and in a strategic way. And we realized there was a call to action that if we didn't do anything about this, we'd be in a dramatic deficit position with regards to a balanced demographic that we always want to keep here at Fleischer, compared to the realities of our surrounding neighborhood. So, this is what we originally proposed to Wallace, and what we originally thought we needed to do. And it is a very, to me, standard menu of what people's initial approach when they first start thinking about this work is. And we realized, so Wallace was really great, and they said, yes, we would like to support your work. During that time, we actually began to question our initial proposal and really question each other. And that was myself as part of a leadership team, other people who worked here at Fleischer. And we realized that we hadn't asked anyone any questions. And from our experience in watching other people do this work, other organizations do this work, oftentimes no questions had been asked. Other people you're actually trying to engage with. And I guess I tend to think of it as inviting a new friend over to dinner, but you don't ask anything about what they like or don't like. And you create the menu and then hope that it goes well. And these were our revised, excuse me, Excellence Awards. So we focused actually almost 3 years of the work on research, a very large initial piece of work with Slover Lynette, who was a great partner, to identify who was here and who was not at Fleischer, understands the motives of those who participated versus those who we hoped would participate. And we really zeroed in on 3 specific ethnic and racial communities in what we consider our catchment area. And that was a long-standing African-American community, a newly arrived Latino community, and a newly arrived, specifically Southeast Asian community in Philadelphia. And what our studies, this is what our studies, our research was comprised of. There were student focus groups, there was an ethnographic study, and then we began having surveys internally to use as a baseline to see if the population was changing over time internally at Fleischer. I want to say this, that I just want to really emphasize what some of the other speakers have said in terms of our work here was in partnership with a group called Southeast Philadelphia Collaborative, which is, and Fleischer is a founding member of that organization. And that is a consortium primarily of social service agencies that work with actually many of the communities that we were interested in working in. And they were really great at helping us find people to participate in the focus groups, in the ethnographic studies, and were, I think, what it allowed Fleischer to have is what I refer to as trust by proxy with communities that we may not have built a relationship of trust with yet. But because we had a relationship with an organization they did trust, we were allowed this privilege. And this is what we found, our initial research found, that at that time, the typical student at Fleischer was a white female, not necessarily from Southeast Philadelphia, anywhere from 40 to 60, college educated, and actually also chances were also had a higher degree and had spent 3 or more years at Fleischer. And the community we were attempting to engage was much more racially and culturally mixed. They skewed younger. They were likely to have they were less likely to have graduated high school or college and had no idea about Fleischer, their programs, and really had less time for leisure activities. These were people who were working very hard and creating a new life in a new country for themselves. What I do want to add is what we did find was these communities did have artistic practices of their own. And I think sometimes we mix up the fact that someone is disengaged with our institution with the fact that they're disengaged with the arts in general. And people had their own artistic practices. We had to know why they didn't feel free to come to Fleischer. And so our mantra emerged from this work, which was 3 things came out of our initial study. People told us what they wanted. We don't know who you are, come to us. We don't know what you do, show us what you do. And if we choose to interact with your institution, be ready for us, welcome us, make us feel like there's a place where we belong. And so what we realized was there was a lot of internal work that had to happen first, and that we were transforming a cultural institution. And I can go into more detail later about what we did. But here, this is some example of how we shared the work with everyone on staff and the board. And so what I really want to do, close with, was that the work has to be embedded in the institution. That this work actually made Fleischer what I refer to as a learning institution. We ask ourselves lots of questions, and we still do, and that we became multilingual. So we were able to explain the work to other staff, the board, funders, and we actually created our own internal definition for community engagement so that everyone could rally around one vision of what that work really meant. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Magda. And a couple of questions have come in that I think are relevant to anyone in the audience. And so I'm going to turn them to all of you in our special guest audience. How do you get disengaged community residents to participate in a focus group? How do you do that with people who don't even know you are there? Anybody have any response to that they would like to share?
I can certainly respond to that. Go ahead, whoever's speaking.
I was going to say I touched on that just now, and the route we took was to actually, we had long been partnering with organizations that served those communities, and they actually it was the trust by proxy thing that I was talking about. They helped us find people who didn't know about Fleischer, and helped us put those focus groups together. So that was part of our approach.
And this is Beth. The other thing I was going to comment on is that you identify where they are going. And as Magda says, that's where you find them, but then you still have to engage them in conversation. And that can be challenging. Sometimes it's a conversation that is about introducing them to a new concept. Sarah Lee and I worked on a project together where that was really a lot about finding audiences that were not engaged to understand how a culturally specific organization might be able to engage them. And we had to literally go out and find people who either had not heard of the institution or ever visited a similar type of institution in order to understand what might motivate them.
Yeah, and this is Sarah Lee, and I would add to that sometimes the place to start isn't necessarily a focus group or a more formal structured conversation like that. That one of the components which Magda mentioned about the work that we did with Fleischer was to actually engage in a community ethnographic study where we have a fieldwork team that actually spent a lot of time in the neighborhoods around Fleischer to really understand what art and creativity meant from those communities' perspectives rather than starting with the institutional perspective. So sometimes the way to start the conversation is really just to spend time in those neighborhoods among the communities and start by understanding what's important to them. and from there, then you can go into a more structured conversation about the ways that your institution can fulfill some of those needs that you've identified.
Thank you, Sarah Lee. And I know that, Betty, you had something you'd like to share about your process at Minnetrista, helping you rethink goals in a similar way that Magda described for Fleischer.
Right. She started with one series of goals and then shifted her focus. We had been asking ourselves a lot of questions here about our audiences, so in the process, we would tweak this program or add this program or make a change here. But as we went into strategic planning, and with the benefit, admittedly, of a grant from the Institute of Museum and Library Services, we started focusing on the audience research. And because we wanted, I think it was Bob that talked about relationship building, maybe it was Beth, because we knew we really wanted to be audience-centric and build a relationship with our audiences, what we wanted to know was not so much the normal demographics of who was coming to see us at Minnetrista, but why they were coming. We were really interested in motivations. We're a 40-acre campus with very diverse offerings, very diverse programs. So the feedback that we got back in all of our audience survey information led us towards John Fox's identification of audience motivations in his book, Identity in the Museum Visitor Experience. And we identified from that key motivators for our audiences. Interestingly enough, one of the largest was rechargers. We have 20 acres plus of gardens, so I guess that's not too much of a surprise. But people that come here primarily because it helps them feel refreshed, it lets them refocus, that type of thing. And then we also have explorers and facilitators. That's fairly obvious, somebody who wants to see what's going on, but with facilitators, think mom and child or parents and children, that type of thing. And we also decided we would focus a little on some of our hobbyists, being the home of the ball jar. As you might imagine, we do a lot of canning. We do, with 20 acres of gardens, we have a lot of gardening projects. So this really allowed us to refocus on who was coming, which then allowed us to refocus our messaging to bring more of those folks to Minnetrista's campus. And as I said, it's still a work in progress, and we're still really keying in on those motivations.
Betty, thanks. I appreciate you sharing false motivators with us, and I just happened to have one of these files in our stock, and I pulled it up just so folks in our audience would have a little bit of idea of what you are referencing. And Sarah, Jesse, I want you to touch on a little bit what you mentioned to us earlier about funders and funders being okay with shifting goals and revisions to a proposal.
Yes, Magda had brought that up, that I love, Magda, that you shared with us your original proposal and then how much it shifted once you learned more about the goals in the audience. And it's lovely when a funder is willing to go on that journey with you and they understand that. So it's great that Wallace is like that. We had a similar situation at LACMA with the James Irvine Foundation, where we were doing a project where we specifically wanted to work with people that we've never worked with before, right, and go to communities that we've never been. So with that, there were a lot of things that we learned along the way, a ton of surprises, and it seemed like every 3 months or so we were going to the funder saying, we learned this information, is it okay if we shift it in this way? And they were so supportive of that. And I think often when we write grant proposals, we feel this pressure to put ourselves in a position of knowing everything or being the expert, and really it's nice when funders understand that we're trying to do something that's unprecedented here. Work with us, and it's great that the Wallace did with Magda's program.
Sarah, it's funny, this is Betty again. It's funny you should say that, because when we submitted our proposal to IMLS, one of the reviewers said, well, we're not really sure they know what it is they need to do. And another reviewer came back with, exactly, they don't. That's why they need this grant.
Right. How often does that happen, though? It's
exactly.
kind of rare.
Great. Well, thank you all very much for weighing in. And now I'd like to turn our attention to the Clay Studio and ask Chris Taylor to share with us a little bit of the experience that you've seen happening at your institution.
Thank you. Did my unmute button work? I'm hearable. Thank you all for logging on and staying on, and thank you all, Bob, Adam, and my other colleagues here. My name is Chris Taylor. I'm president of Clay Studio. I've been here since 2011. I'm going to split my presentation a bit today between the first few steps that Bob had mentioned, discussion a bit about our history and programs and some of our early results, and then talking again on March 18th about some of the shift of our own thinking, results, and next steps. I'm a little shaken. I've got an exciting email about 20 minutes ago that popped up that is very relevant here. That's extremely good news. So I hope you all tune in on March 18th. I can share that news about some next steps that we're working on here. We were funded over 4 years with Wallace to do market research, understand and expand our audience, and really grow our impact among 25 to 45-year-olds. And we were very interested as well in some of the marketing and messaging and how we speak to that particular demographic. The history of the Clay Studio: we were founded in 1974 by 5 artists. We are really at our core a place for artists and for building community. In 1979, we formed 501c3 and really started to expand our reach and have a long history of moving out into community with exhibitions, moving into community with classes, bringing international artists through, and along with that expansion of programming, certainly expanding our community. In 1989, we moved into our current facility with 3 other partnering arts organizations. Those were subletting with us, similar like-minded arts groups, and it was really the creation of Philadelphia's famous First Friday activities. I have a photo of our building a few slides later. It will help to understand who we are and what our facility looks like. A few of our programs, listed here. We're in a 21,000 square foot building with 4 floors and 2 buildings, actually. Our residency program is highly competitive professional track artists, residency for up to 12 emerging artists. Our classes and workshops are very much a public education opportunity for ceramic art and processes to come and do 10-week classes, 5-week classes, workshops, and clay camps. A rental program allows artists and amateurs alike to rent space from us and really build a community in clay. Our work exchange program is a training for future young ceramic artists and those going into the nonprofit professional field. Our outreach program is an award-winning Claymobile 2 vans that travel around the city and meet with schools and community centers and interact in festivals, etc. Our shop and gallery really is about highlighting the functional artwork and the sculptural work of artists from all over North America, up to 30 exhibitions each year. We also have an international guest artist program that we've come to be known for in our field. 2007, we really did, I think, start to recognize when change is needed if we refer to effective practices. You might be familiar with a lot of the folks on the webinar today of really trying to understand maybe after an expansion, you look at your audience and things start to grow, but maybe don't grow where you think you are, where you think you need. At the time, we were just past our 30th anniversary, and this year, we've passed, last year was our 40th anniversary. So we really were taking a deep look at where our audience was, increasing our donors and people participating in this newly expanded facility. I noticed earlier someone had asked a question about what are social workshops. We had some of those workshops underway, but really weren't understanding the audience for our younger group we were starting to identify as a target. Really see these social workshops, the intention is a little more social, as it were. Maybe you have a beer and a wine and learn how to make, rather than sort of an educational motivation where you might be building a skill in pottery or mosaics or mold making. So when I say social workshops, we really are talking about the social side and social activity. Market research, these, hopefully you can see these two on the left. They really started to tell us a lot about participation. We were targeting young professionals, as I said, age 25 to 45. We had identified specific zip codes where we felt there was a growing youth professional group, and with some disposable income who would engage in our programs. These are the neighborhoods of Old City, Rittenhouse, Queen Village, and the Art Museum sections of Philadelphia. The market research was conducted online surveys, focus groups, telephone interviews, looking into those zip codes and at those demographics. We discovered that most people were coming as a group, or at least not alone. It was a 67% versus 33% coming alone. So we knew that it was a social experience coming for First Friday openings, various early forms of our date nights and our workshops. And when we looked deeper at that audience, I think this larger graph to the right was, I think, one of the most interesting graphs, that many people were coming who were, who were never before, 36% had never before visited the clay studio. They were this group of people who may have considered themselves high cultural consumers, but they were skipping stones. I think I've heard a phrase where they participate at one time at one theater, one time at the museum, one time at the clay studio. They themselves are high cultural consumers, but you may see them as a one-time shot. At your particular institution, that's what we were finding. But then we look at the left part of that graph, 40% of them were coming 4 times or more. So there was this interesting dip between those samplers and then those who were deeply committed. So we had sort of those two ends of the spectrum. And when we did a deeper dive into those who were brand new, we realized that was our target group. They were the ones who were in that 25 to 45 young professional bracket. And I know that we sort of started taking out some of the guesswork to the audiences that we were investigating. It's interesting. We all know from performing arts groups this idea of season tickets were starting to shrink, and the more flexible participation was talked about among theater groups and our colleagues in performing art. But here was some data telling us that same thing in visual arts. They were coming, they were sampling, they were maybe not engaging as deeply in one institution. As I mentioned, we were trying to really understand as well how to speak with these new audiences and how to, what avenues we were speaking to them and sort of the language we were using to speak with them. When we asked, how did you hear about us? This chart hopefully is able to read. This was over 2 particular samplings. The yellow there in 2008 and the darker color there in 2010. We found that over 50% of people were hearing by word of mouth. So we realized very clearly that customer service and the experience once they were here was very important, and has actually become integrated into the institution as far as our hiring and our training, and putting a strong focus on the user experience and interactions. We'll talk about that some more, I think, in subsequent webinars, aligning our institution. As Bob mentioned earlier, our phrasing of shaping the future of ceramics was really meaningless to a lot of newcomers. We've actually since dropped that from our logo, and we're working to either think through a new tagline or just keep one off of there because it wasn't meaningful. And Bob also mentioned our action words, thinking about how people wanted to interact with us rather than really looking so much at work. They really wanted to, quote, roll up their sleeves and get dirty with us. This particular ad, I love putting this ad out there. These are two of the straightest bro guys you've ever met who decided it would be fun to do the ad for the LGBT date night. They're really two cool work exchange guys who work with us. And the phrase, again, get dirty with us, was a little more playful. I think an interesting note on our graph here, certainly between 2008 and 2010, was a tripling of the internet, and we've really focused how people heard about us through the internet. And it was, we all know that's happening. It's nothing new to know that that's growing, but to really see that and say, okay, we're focusing much more on our social media, on our emails, and how do our emails look and feel and interact. Again, that's a bit more about aligning the institution. We'll talk later, but it was very important as we started to really talk with new audience. And just to sort of summarize for today, I do want to leave a little cliffhanger for March 18th, next Wednesday. We had initially, actually, I do want to mention too, I noticed Magda, and we've had that conversation about changing and being flexible. We maintained a very clear path for our audience and how we wanted to conduct the project with Wallace, but we initially thought people would come in through the gallery and through our objects, and Bob mentioned that earlier, that we kept hearing, no, we want to come in, we want to play, we want to get dirty and roll up our sleeves, and we really had to be flexible and start to understand ourselves as a place of making. It's interesting, it's in our building, the school is on the 3rd floor. Many people will come in their first time and come to the gallery and shop and may not know. It's interesting, we're almost hiding it. So we've added televisions behind our checkout counter so we can say, here's other things that happen. And we changed our website to say action words like see and learn, as Bob mentioned earlier. I think some of the early challenges, or at least things we need to really understand, were the 10-week classes. Again, Bob mentioned earlier, were barriers to involvement. Imagine coming into a clay place and saying, oh, I did this when I was in high school. I'd like to try it again. And we said, sure, 10 weeks and $300. It just was a real barrier. And remember, these are also maybe master's level ceramic artists who, they just spent 7 years in school learning how to do this. So 10 weeks was already shrinking it down. So that to get our thinking around a one-night class and really think about social versus educational, but also educational, it was an interesting shift that took time. Also thinking of time, our Young Supporters program was very slow to start. A few people got together and it kind of went down. We held an event that wasn't successful. And even to the point when I came on, I said, well, we've got to get this group going. And there was a lot of hesitation that we've tried that before. It's not really working. We had a big grant to do it and it wasn't working. So it was, I think, important lesson here is having patience to expand with new audience. I think, too, just one last thing before I wrap up. I think as we start to think about aligning our organization, there was a lot of work to do, whether it was, you can see here in the middle, a lot of artwork. Adding all these workshops and starting to get going was adding thousands of pieces of artwork to our process, from firing to shipping to pickups. So it's been a very interesting shift in our organizational thinking. So I think it's important to look at data, understand data, really see how it's aligning with your goals. And certainly, I would say patience, because a lot of things weren't able to happen as fast as you like. So with that, I think I may turn it back over in the interest of time for everyone. And back to Bob, perhaps, or Greg.
Thanks very much, Chris. I appreciate it. And there's a couple of really interesting questions and some comments in the chat box regarding diversity of audiences, and not just from an urban-centric point of view. And so any of our colleagues in the audience or our special guests who feel like they want to tackle what it might mean for a museum to address diversity and with geographic isolation or education disparity, income disparity, I welcome you to weigh in here. And in the meantime, Sarah Lee, I think you had something to offer in terms of addressing multiple audiences.
Yeah, there was a question about how to think about serving two very different audiences, and the example that was in the question was locals and tourists. And I'm not going to address that specific those two specific audiences, but wanted to just sort of offer a little bit of a perspective on how to think about balancing the needs of two different audiences. And part of that is I think just to sort of say that just by if you do audience research, that doesn't commit you to necessarily acting on everything that emerges from those insights. But that if you do audience research among the multiple audiences that you're trying to serve, that is very likely to surface some areas where there are overlapping opportunities, opportunities to make the experience better for both or all of the audiences that you're trying to serve. So I think that there needs to be a real interplay between the process of conducting audience research and the process of interpreting those results and filtering them through the lens of your organizational mission to figure out exactly how you act on that. And I think that, again, asking the questions of both audiences is a great starting point for thinking about how to ultimately serve both of them well.
That's actually, I want to actually pick up on that point a little bit, because one of the problems or some of the resistance that sometimes we face with audience research is that there are people that think, oh, well, this will actually ask us to change how we do things, or maybe even change our programming. And in fact, we actually found the opposite was true, that people really want the full-on artistic experience, and that when you give them that, that's what really creates a great sticky experience that keeps coming back. You can maybe, just to use the popular term, dumb it down for a night to get people in the door once. But if you really want that long-term relationship, it's about providing the full artistic experience. And we found that actually audience research helped many organizations strengthen their artistic mission, and that's what it was used the best.
Yeah, Bob, I want to follow up on that. We certainly found that when I was at Hirshhorn, which allows me to answer two questions here. One is that one about, do you dumb it down in order to broaden your audience? And I think what we found was that when we became clear about what our unique role was, which was to offer a contemporary art experience that was not otherwise available in the area, we decided that whoever came to that was coming for that reason. Now the second piece, so we didn't choose more accessible works. We curated those events exactly the way we would curate an event for our regular audiences. What we also faced though was that because we were on the National Mall, we had a very significant tourist audience and a local audience. Now where the Hirshhorn at the time was falling down a little bit was that they really were not, they were thinking about the tourist audience and not thinking about the local audience. And the local audience wanted more opportunities for deeper engagement and for more feeling of community relationship around the Hirshhorn. That caused us to begin to think about, well, how did we become a really great local museum? We knew how to be a really great national museum. We didn't know how to be a good local museum. So that was the difference for us, was really to begin to target our local audiences, to invite them in, to create these experiences that allowed them to see other experiences as well, even if it was just a one-time stop for them.
Great, thanks very much, Beth. And I wonder if Tim or Sarah Jesse, if you have anything you want to add to this conversation?
Well, I guess I'm kind of thinking out loud a little bit as I'm hearing our presenters talk, and I'm hearing some of the comments, or reading some of the comments in the chat box, and it's kind of actually a question more, and I don't know if we have time to address it, but I'm just wondering more about the difference between, I guess, demographics and psychographics, because as these questions are coming in about age and about, you know, tourists versus locals, I mean, how much of that matters and how much of it is really more about people's predilections, inclinations, their psychographic more than it is, you know, if they're African American or Asian or Hispanic or something, or 50 years old or 12 years old, I mean, in some ways.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I think that's a hugely important point, and I think that it's important to talk about both demographics and psychographics, but Sarah, Jesse, I think you're exactly right that often thinking in psychographic terms and understanding that content of what makes a meaningful connection for someone is probably even more important for understanding how to successfully engage them.
If I can jump in, if that's appropriate. I agree with everyone, and I think it also goes to another question that I saw in the chat box, which was how did we keep our present constituents when we were going after new constituents? So I just want to clear up, it doesn't mean that the groups we chose weren't represented at Fleischer, and I think this goes to psychographics. It's just those people who were here at Fleischer who may have represented certain ethnic groups shared a psychographic profile with the people who were already here, right? And so the communities that we were looking at really represented people who felt differently, perhaps who had not been in the United States as long, who didn't share the same educational experiences as those people who were already here. And I think it also speaks to sustainability, which is, I try not to think about this as an either-or proposition. Either I'm serving these people or I'm serving those people. That's not sustainable. I think what we have found is our research has actually made us overall a more welcoming institution to everyone. So many of the lessons that we've learned through some very focused research actually we could apply to everyone at Fleischer in terms of our work, in terms of the way we thought about our publications. You know, we went from a course listing that looked like a college catalog to a one-sheet fold-out. And what we heard from people already at Fleischer was, this is great, this is so much easier to read, right? We did it because we were trying to handle issues of language. So I think also broadening the way we think about the work can also help us see how it applies differently.
Great, thanks Magda. And Bob, I think you had something that you wanted to add, a resource from Wallace.
Right, yeah, I mean, someone had asked a question about the research being done by organizations and advice for baby steps and understanding an audience and what to do if you don't have the support of a large funder. I mean, you know, the reason why Wallace funds organizations, I mean, they want to fund them to give them money, but also it's really part of what drives them is to actually create learning for others to use. So in that spirit, within the next few months, they'll be publishing a book called Taking Out the Guesswork. It's a guidebook to audience research for really getting started. It's not for organizations that are already there. It's for organizations that really want to get started with how to learn about an audience. And it includes a lot of low-cost but very effective ways to do it, both case study examples and step-by-step examples as well.
Great, thank you very much, Bob. And I think your reference to the Wallace Foundation is an excellent segue to the end of our program and into next week's program, which is part 2 of the Road to Results series, in which we'll talk about aligning the organization around your audience building strategies. And that will be followed up on March 25th by the third and last part of the series, Road to Results, Engaging the Audience. And so I hope that all of you will be joining us for that series. When you registered for today's program, you were automatically registered for all 3, so you should be getting information from us about these programs. I do want to take a moment and thank all of our colleagues for joining us today, Bob and Beth, Magda, Chris, Sarah Lee, Tim Hallman, Sarah Jesse, and Betty Brewer for sharing their time and their expertise and their thoughtful responses with us. And would also like to thank once again our professional networks for being a part of this program series and for hosting local webinar watch and talk events. And lastly, to thank our colleagues at the Wallace Foundation for making this program happen. We are very grateful for their participation and leadership in helping all of us in the arts and cultural field know more about and build our audiences. With that said, my name is Greg Stevens, Assistant Director for Professional Development, and on behalf of all of us